Just taking a bit to load. Sorry, it's loading right now. Okay, peace, people. We're here with Real Talk. We're here on Real Talk with Tehran Pool. We have a treat for you today. And for me, it's truly an honor to be here with our esteemed guest, Dr. Shehzad Saleem. Assalamu alaikum, sir. How are you doing today?
Wa alaikum assalam. I'm fine, alhamdulillah.
Okay. And just to give a bit of background for our audience, you are a research fellow at the Al-Mawrid Institute in Pakistan, author
Right.
of over a dozen publications, two including History of the Quran, Concise Study, and History of the Quran, Critical Study. You have close to 1,000 videos on YouTube on a wide variety of topics that I recommend the audience to go check out. They definitely will find something they're interested in. And one thing I found interesting, you conduct activity-based workshops for adults and teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
Among your hobbies, I come to find out that you're an avid tennis player. You enjoy playing chess, swimmer, writer of poetry. And one that I would like to ask you about is cricket. A couple years ago, I had a chance to work at the Ashes here in Manchester when England and Australia were playing. And that was
Mm-hmm.
my first time being exposed to cricket. And I
Mm-hmm.
found it to be a truly fun, interesting sport. What got you into cricket, Dr.
Oh,
Saleem?
well, if you're a Pakistani, you don't need to ask because cricket is in the blood of every Pakistani. You'll hardly find a person here who is not into cricket. And if there is one, he'll be the odd one out.
Okay. And so you made sure that you weren't the odd one out. Well, how
Yeah.
well were you at cricket? Were you very
Well,
competitive?
it was more of a friendly cricket that we used to play at school, at college. We still play at times occasionally within the family, amongst friends. So it's more of a leisure activity, nothing professional about it.
Okay. I'm also, you also like to read history. Outside of the history of the Quran, what is your favorite point in history that you like to research or just read casually?
Yeah, it's just a casual read of various portions of history. It could be British history, it could be history of Pakistan, the Indo-Pak subcontinent, history of the US. So it's like various eras of history I lay hands on, and then biographies of various people who, of course, have a rich content of history as well. So it's not anything in particular that I pursue an ordered way, but just pick up things randomly and start reading them.
Okay. Yeah, I'm pretty much the same way. Uh, my my interest concerning history is very wide, and it seems like once you start reading about one topic, it leads you to another topic that might be
Right.
totally different, but in some way interconnected to what you were previously reading. I'm
Hmm.
also aware that you're very much into poetry. Following you on Facebook, I notice you're always posting poems. Some of them seems like you wrote them yourself. Some of them seem like you got from other people. And your latest book is a book of poems. And I wanted to ask you, are those poems yours or are they compilations of ones that you favor?
So my own anthology of poetry is called "From the Core of My Heart," and I had it published last year. So that's my own collection of poems. Other than that, I have interest in poetry, Persian poetry, Arabic poetry, English, and Urdu. So all four languages. This is one of my pastimes, my leisure activities. That whenever I feel a little tired or maybe would like to change my taste, so I pick up poetry from here and there. I have a lot of books in the collection, and now, of course, everything is available online as well. So that's like a relaxation for me when I read poetry. And of course, writing poetry is something which depends highly on some inspiration that you get by some vision or maybe some sight that you've seen or by anything that has made an impact on your mind.
Okay, so for you, when you write poetry, it's not something like you just sit down and okay, this is what I'm going to do at this specific time. But more so, you see something, hear something, feel
Yeah.
something,
Right.
and it just flows onto
Yeah.
paper.
That's it.
Okay, all right, that's really interesting. Uh, I'm also aware that you have a PhD in Quranic studies, which you obtained in Wales. Uh, are you from Wales, or are you from the
No.
UK, or were
No,
you?
no. So I have been stationed in Pakistan all the while that I was doing my PhD, because the University of Wales, there is this distance learning program as well, in which you are required to attend college or university for a few months in the year or a few weeks in the year, and the rest is your own dissertation. So because we don't have any coursework in UK, mostly it's the dissertation that you start off with. So I wrote my dissertation mostly when I was here in my own country, and I traveled a little bit for my research to other countries. But as far as the UK is concerned, I needed to travel just twice there, once to visit my professor, my supervisor. So, and he was pretty much satisfied. And of course, before that happened, we were in touch through emails, and I would keep sending him my work, and he didn't want me to come every year, because initially I had to come every year, but he just said that because I'm going okay, so I don't need to come. So I had to go the last 2 years. So, and once to meet my professor and submit my work and see how things had shaped up. And then the last time to exactly defend my thesis there. So my defense was right in the university premises.
Okay. And why did you choose to write your thesis on the topic that you chose?
Well, there is an interesting history behind it, and that is that I was actually called upon to teach graduate students history of the Quran. And I thought it would be an easy sailing, because we Muslims have been told since childhood that the Quran has a very, very, very prominent history. It was revealed by the Almighty, and the Almighty, since himself had taken the promise to preserve it. So therefore, that's the end of that. And I always thought that if this is so simple a history, whatever I'm going to teach, how can I cover a semester? Because it was a whole semester that I had to teach.
Mhm.
And when I started to read about this material, this was way back in 1999, so almost 22 years ago. So when I started reading the material on this topic, I was simply shocked at a number of things. And therefore, when I actually compiled my syllabus and began teaching, actually, I myself had a number of questions on this subject. And I knew that I would not be able to do justice by teaching it, because I myself was not very satisfied. For I knew that some of the questions that I would put before my class needed very strong answers, and the answers by that time I never had. So I made a commitment to myself that once I'm through with this course, however, I had to labor through the course. I will labor through the course, but when I finish the course, I'm going to make it a point of a mission of my life, actually, to find out what actually are the answers of these questions. So, Alhamdulillah, the course went okay. There's not much of a problem, because some of the questions that I had in mind were more advanced. So it was okay. But then, as soon as I finished my course in 1999, it was a semester course, I got down to studying this. And then there came an opportunity that I could even register for this course as a PhD student. So my own institute, which was sponsoring me for my studies, when I told them that this is one of the opportunities that I have, and they also needed that I do a degree from outside Pakistan. So it kind of matched each other. And then I started my PhD precisely on this topic. So my PhD actually covered a partial uh, part of the history of the Quran that I ultimately wrote about, that you were just referring to. And once I completed my studies, then I went for a postdoctoral study, not in the formal way, but in an informal way, under the guidance of my mentor, Javed Ahmad Ghamidi. You might have heard of him. So
Yes.
even my doctoral studies were supervised by him informally, but my postdoctoral studies were surely very much supervised by him. So once I completed both these studies, the doctoral one and the postdoctoral one, then I thought of combining them and publishing this book. So the book that you might have seen or heard of is basically a labor of about 14 years I would say, 14 to 16 years. And then actually it covers, as I said, part of my, a major part of my PhD thesis and a very major part of my postdoctoral work.
You know, that was the topic at first I was going to talk to you about, transmission of the Quran and its different variants. But the more and more I looked into it, I looked at the contents of your work and everything that was out there concerning the topic. I was like, wow, this is just too big of a topic for me to engage with in an interview. But it's an interesting one nonetheless. I know, as I mentioned to you before, I first saw you speaking with Mufti Abu Lake on his Mind Trap, and that was around the time when the variant Quran debacle had transpired. I really didn't think too much of it then, because I thought that some of the things you said satisfied how I felt about it, and some other things that but after looking into it again because of this interview, there's a lot that I don't know that I'm interested in looking into. Unfortunately, we're going to go a different direction with this interview, which I still believe is right up your alley. But we're just going to take it back a little bit. So what was your upbringing like? Were you always big on education? Is it something that your parents or family instilled in you?
As far as education is concerned, yes, of course, this is something that I always had a passion for, to study. So studying came something as something very naturally to me, and my father, both my parents and my paternal side and maternal side all are into education. And so as far as general education is concerned, this was something that kind of a tradition that we followed. And so I just jumped into the bandwagon, as they say, and started studying. And it was actually early in my life, when I was about 14 years old, that I lost my father. He passed away. This is about 40 years ago. And that was actually a turning point in my life, a big turning point, I would say. Because that is the point when I became very serious in my study, in my approach towards life. And I had these questions roaming in my mind as to what is death and what is after death, and where do we come from, what is our purpose in life, who is God. So all those theological questions which might not crop up in the mind of a 14-year-old so many years ago, they did crop up in my mind as a result of my father's death. And that, as I said, was the time when I shifted more towards philosophical readings and religious readings. But again, I followed my course for the next, I would say, almost 7 or 8 years, because I completed my college education. Then I went to my university education. I did my an undergrad degree in engineering. And it was basically in my last year of engineering, this was something in some way, sometime in 1988, when actually I decided that I would pursue studies, my further studies as a student of religion. So that was my last year in my electrical engineering program. And from then onwards, it was just a stroke of luck that I came in touch with my mentor through a incident that, I mean, it happened out of nowhere. And so that was again in the middle of 1988. So I got in touch with him, and I had already made up my mind that I would pursue Islamic studies. So somehow we got connected, and when he came to know that this was my passion and my aim in life, so he said, well, this is an opportunity that he could offer me by teaching me and by asking me to go through some of the books and syllabi which he had himself recommended. So that's how, cutting the long story short, I dipped into Islamic studies.
Okay, and as you just mentioned, you've been under the tutelage of Professor Javed Ahmad Ghamidi since 1988, or since 1988 in religious studies. What attracted you towards his scholarship?
Well, as I said, this was a sheer, I would say, a freak incident which happened. I actually met his own mentor, Ghamidi Sahab's own mentor, Amin Islahi, if you would know him by name. He was alive at that time. And I had some questions in my mind, and I went over to one of his lectures, and he was hard on hearing. And so we couldn't ask questions directly to him, and we had to write our questions, and then it had been a back and forth sort of a thing. So when I put forth my questions, some of the participants of that lecture said that, well, this would be difficult for Islahi Saab to answer, because at that time he was over 80 plus. I mean, he was like 85 or something like that. And he had to labor a lot to write down and dictate. So some of his students said, well, instead of discussing these questions with Islahi, why don't you go to one of his students who lives nearby? And I said, okay, that's fine. So I just went there immediately after the lecture, and I just connected with him, and I found him there at his house. And I said that some of the questions that I have are these. And he said, okay, well, come back after some time. I had a book with me, and he said, just leave the book with him. And then he said, you come back after a week, and the questions that you have regarding the book, we'll discuss them. So it was in our second meeting that when I was discussing those answers that he had prepared after reading the book, that he then asked me that that if you have this interest in Islamic studies, that what exactly do you plan to do? So that was that second meeting with him, which actually became the basis of my strong connection with him. And ever since that time, it's about 31 years ago, I am in touch almost on a daily basis with him.
If you can, if you remember, what were the questions in the book that you had gave him?
So the book was regarding women subjugation. So mostly how women are treated, and especially some of the questions like the hijab and the niqab aspect, and the way they should dress up themselves, and how exactly should they conduct themselves in life. So it was more critique on the traditional point of view of niqab and hijab. And the person, I'm just forgetting the author's name, it'll come to my mind. So he had actually argued that whatever Muslim scholarship at the moment is putting up in vis-a-vis the concept of hijab and niqab is against the Quran. It's more on tradition based, more based on hadith, and a lot of things are not that authentic. And till that time, I was pretty traditional and orthodox in my approach. And I thought that this book is actually needlessly criticizing Islam or the Islamic concept of hijab. But I didn't have enough knowledge to, so to speak, give a direct answer. And actually, the background of this was that this book was actually sent to me by one of my cousins who was living in the U.S. So she's a doctor now. She was, of course, not a doctor at that time. And I actually, when I wrote to her regarding some of my views, so she sent me that book regarding hijab and niqab, and she said that, well, you're caught up in the wrong, among the wrong people. This is not what Islam says. And she was actually promoting that book and saying that, look at this person, he is presenting the right view. And I thought that it was the other way around. So so that's what led me. But the reason that I went to Islahi Saab in the first place was that actually my own reading of the Quran was what gave me this impression that the Quran is a disjointed book, because once you start off reading a topic, suddenly you find another topic creeping up, and there doesn't seem to be a connection between the two topics, and then a third one comes up, and so on and so forth. So one of my friends in Lahore, he's passed away, unfortunately. He passed away last year in the UK. So he actually advised me that there is a person called Amin Islahi, and he has written a commentary of the Quran, which actually tells us why and how the topic in a particular sequence progresses within a surah, and there is no disjointedness in the Quran. There is a very profound coherence, and that coherence is something that you need to understand by studying his tafsir. So his tafsir, of course, is called Tadabbur Quran. So my first meeting had already taken place with Islahi Saab vis-a-vis this particular book, the Tadabbur Quran. And when I went to his lecture the second time, when the book had arrived later on, so that was how I was inspired. Well, I said that if there's a person, a scholar of the Quran who has written a commentary, so he's going to be very helpful for me in answering that question regarding hijab and niqab. And as I just said, that then from there I was sent to Ghamidi Saab, and he actually, of course, studied the book. And so we had a long discussion, and of course, that's another story. But as you asked that what was exactly the topic, so this was the topic, and this is how things shaped up.
Amazing. Going back to Amin Islahi's commentary on the Quran, not seeing it as a disjointed book where the verses are individuals, but looking at it as a whole. Is this his original theory, or did he get this from somebody or from somewhere?
So I think people who are in touch with the academic circles and people who are in touch with the history of Quranic tafsir, they must be knowing that Islahi owes a lot to his own mentor, and his name is Hamiduddin Farahi. So he was a scholar in India who died in 1930. And Islahi had the good fortune of studying with him for 5 years. The last 5 years of Farahi's life, from 1925 to 1930, Islahi was with him like a shadow. And basically, he learned the principles of reflection on the Quran from his mentor, Farahi. Farahi was not able to write a complete commentary of the Quran. We have few of his notes, and we have 14 surahs of the Quran, which he actually, on which he wrote his exegesis. But of course, he couldn't complete it. And he has a number of other books as well, but the commentary couldn't complete. So Islahi was born in 1904, and he passed away in 1997. So from 1925 to 1930, when he was about 21 years of age, a rather tender age, so he was had this chance of living, in fact, in a place where his own mentor was living next door. It was like he would stay there with him for days. So this is how he learned himself the principles of deliberation on the Quran and this whole theory of coherence in the Quran. And then in 1958, was the time when he left the Jamaat-e-Islami. So Islahi's life himself is something that, itself is something which has a lot of aspects that you can cover. But to cut the long story short, in 1941, he had joined the Jamaat-e-Islami founded by Maududi, and he was one of the founding members. But after 17 years of membership with the Jamaat, he had his differences. And so he quit the Jamaat in 1956 or 57. And then in 1958, actually, he started writing this book, this tafsir, this exegesis of the Quran, which actually spanned about 22 years. So he finished it in somewhere in 1980, began in 1958. So it covers a major part of his mentor's thought. But one cannot say that it is a mere reproduction of what his mentor has taught him. Because we have his mentor's notes and some of the tafsir of his surahs as well. If we compare them, we can see that there are a number of places in which he has elaborated upon his own mentor's views, and there are other places in which he has significantly differed or added some new aspects. So what I can say, and in summary, is that yes, he did take the coherence in the Quran theory from his mentor, but then he added some original things to it and some very significant details from his own research.
But you would still call it Farahi hermeneutics.
Yes, if you say so, that I would say it's Farahi hermeneutics. But if you ask me the details, I would say, although the institute or the principle of coherence of the Quran is something which Farahi vociferously advocated, but there are some aspects, for example, the aspect of the structural coherence in the Quran, which means that the Quran is divided into 7 chapters, and each chapter has a distinct theme, and then in each chapter there are Meccan and Medinan surahs. The Meccan surahs always precede the Medinan surahs. So the structure of the Quran was something which Islahi actually discovered on his own. And he also showed that whatever he discovered is actually based on a Quranic verse, which says, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَاكَ سَبْعًا مِنَ الْمَثَانِي وَالْقُرْآنِ الْعَظِيمِ. And he showed how the Sab'a min al-Masani refers to 7 chapters of the Quran consisting of surahs which occur in pairs. So this is an original thing that he added to the concept of Nazm of Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi.
And Hamiduddin Farahi is an interesting figure himself.
Right.
One thing that I found very interesting about him is that he learned Hebrew under a German Orientalist and started doing work on the Bible. Is that why Al-Mawrid Institute implements a certain amount of biblical studies into their program, following along in that tradition?
Well, actually, it's there is a slight difference in this, and that is not that he studied Hebrew and he studied Hebrew from Joseph Horowitz, as you might be knowing. the purpose of him studying Hebrew was that the Quran itself refers to the Old and the New Testament copiously and abundantly. And even by the time the Quran itself had been revealed, we know that parts of the Old and the New Testament had been interpolated, but still the Quran said fiha hudan wa nur or fiha hukmullah, or it called the Torah as Furqan. So there are a number of verses in the Quran which tell us to refer to the Bible. And there are certain details in the Bible that if you follow those details, you'll come to understand the scheme of God in which the Quran occupies the last testament or the final testament. So we have the Old and the New and the final testament. They come in sequence. They present the same religion. They have the same faith details by and large. So because of the fact that the Quran itself refers to the Old and the New Testament, that is what inspired Farahi to give importance to Injil. So he wrote a book which is incomplete, which is called Al-Iqlil fi Sharh al-Injil, relating to parts of the Bible in which he tried to write a commentary on. He couldn't complete it, but the inspiration behind reading Hebrew was the Quran itself. And so that tradition has been carried forth by his successors. So Islahi himself, Ghamidi, my own teacher, and then in our generation, all of us, all of us have been taught the Bible. We teach, I personally teach the Bible once a week. And all of us, I mean, when I say all of us, I refer to my contemporaries and students of Ustaz Ghamidi. We take special interest in reading the Bible and biblical literature. So as I said, the main inspiration is from the Quran itself.
That's truly fascinating, especially myself coming from a Christian background, having gone to church my whole life, even as an adult, leaving my mother's house, still going to church.
Right.
And a lot of people ask me, why did I leave Christianity for Islam? And I always tell them, I really don't feel like I left Christianity because, as you mentioned, the faith details are all there. For the most part, all the prophets that I'm aware of in the Quran and in Muslim tradition are present in the Bible. I felt like it only completed what I was upon initially. Sorry, excuse me. One thing I noticed about Professor Ghamidi is that his Farahi interpretations and applications got him in a bit of a hot water in Pakistan. From more, I guess you would say, quote unquote, traditional scholarship. Can you tell me about that?
Well, this happened regarding some of the issues that were raised as a public debate within Pakistan, especially in the background of militancy, terrorism. So Ghamidi Sahab, or my teacher, was a vociferous proponent of the fact that the interpretation of the Quran vis-a-vis some of the jihad verses or some of the qital verses in the Quran have a very specific context, and they are related to the struggle of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and other messengers of God. And although there is a form of jihad which we can still conduct, and that is against persecution and oppression, but the kind of jihad which Osama bin Laden or Mullah Omar or some of their contemporaries think, in which they need to subjugate the world and bring it under an Islamic rule, is something which is a misconception. So one of the things that started this debate was his views about militant expansion of the Muslim empire. And then there was this debate regarding hudud laws, Islamic punishments. And then because he appeared regularly since 2005, I would say, or 2004, when Pakistan was opened up to a lot of international channels. This is 15 or 16 years ago. So he would regularly appear on various TV programs, and there was a cross debate on various issues. And because of the fact that most of these issues, in many of these issues, I would say, like, for example, even in hijab or niqab or in jihad, or like issues like the testimony of women, or regarding Islamic punishments, or whether the fact that democracy is something which is against Islam, or whether the fact that the political system of Islam is it different from a dynastic politics or a monarchy, or whether issues related to interest, what sort of issue regarding banking or the prohibition of interest has caused in international economy. So all these contemporary issues related to almost every sphere of Islam, wherever it connects with social life, they came in debate because of that, because of the opening of those channels, because all these anchor persons, they used to raise these questions, and they would call people from different walks of life or different, I would say, sects, who would come and debate their own point of view. And somehow they were, many of these anchors were positively influenced by Ghamadi's ideas. So they would often call him as one of the guest speakers. And then there would be this crosstalk and a discussion. And on many occasions, it's not because of the fact that I'm a student, but because of the fact that I know so many people who give this feedback. It would seem that Ghamidi, he would be prevailing on the rest of his contestants because of sheer nature of reasoning that he would offer. And this is something which would, of course, be annoying for our traditional scholars, because they would think that he is someone who's now influencing the masses. Because formerly, when he was not on TV, he was just writing. And writing, of course, has a very limited audience. But when you come on public TV and you start discussing your ideas, and then those ideas are also backed up with sound arguments, and they seem to conquer the minds of the common man or the intellectuals of the society or the intelligentsia, then this is something which is generally alarming for our scholars. I have great respect for all my scholars. I in no way intend to demean them in any way, but somehow, unfortunately, this is a perception that I think they might have had, that this person has come from out of nowhere and now started influencing the minds of young people and other important sectors of life. And so this is something which I would say the response that he got was not very congenial. And so there were a lot of fatwas against him, that he has left the folds of Islam, or that he's promoting some other ideology, or he's promoting an American agenda, or maybe a Jewish agenda. So all sorts of there were all sorts of accusations leveled against him. So this is a short background. And then sometime in 2006 or 7, he also became the member of the Council of Islamic Ideology, which is a constitutional body in Pakistan, which gives recommendations regarding the Islamization of laws. So as a member of that body as well, he had a significant influence. And ultimately, of course, he resigned due to certain reasons. But the time that he was there for a couple of years, that again, he had a very strong influence on the members. So I think all these things did not sit pretty against or with people who are more trained in in the traditional way. And because of the fact that Ghamidi was also very critical of the syllabus of these madrasas, he criticized their syllabus, and the basic criticism that he did them, and I think which really hit hard on them, was the fact that he said that all Islamic education should begin after 12 years of school education, in which every subject should be taught, and anyone who would like to become a specialist should always do so after 12 years of broad-based education. And what these madrasas do, they actually put children, very tender minds, like 6 or 7 years of age, and it's basically the decision of their parents. Their parents make up their mind for their children that they have to become scholars, and then at a very tender age, when they need to study various subjects, they are made to study special subjects. So it's like making a child of 6 years old entering into an engineering university or a medical college. So how absurd would be that? So he said it's the same with religious education. How can you force a child at age 6 to learn religion without his own choice and without he getting to know a lot of other subjects? So the basic criticism that he did on those madrasas was that, okay, they can operate, but they should operate once these 12 years of broad-based education is complete. And then the students are given the choice themselves. So just as they opt after high school for any specialization or any profession, so those of them who would opt for a Islamic profession or Islamic scholarly profession, so it would be out of their own choice. So this is something which, of course, was not very well received. And then he also criticized the syllabus of these universities or madrasas or seminaries, in which, of course, militancy or jihad was taught as a doctrine. in which, as I just referred to, that subjugation of the world by a Muslim Khilafat, universal Muslim Khilafat, that needs to be first established, and it should be extended globally so that every country of the globe actually becomes subservient to it.
You know, this was one. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut in.
Yeah, so this is a basic summary of what actually ensued, or what has ensued in the last 10 or 15 years in Pakistan. And you might be knowing that there were life threats to him. So he left the country in 2009 for Malaysia. And he stayed there for about 10 years. And then in 2018 or 19, he shifted to the US, where he's currently residing. But the reason of his departure from Pakistan was not simply because of the threats that he had been receiving ever since 2005 or 6. And two of his contemporaries, one of his contemporary was shot and wounded, and he miraculously survived. And two of his very close students were actually assassinated in broad daylight. Or one of them, of course, in his clinic. Both were doctors. So one in the morning, one of them in broad daylight, another one in the evening. And the people entered as terrorists and just shot them point blank. So this did not make him leave the country, I would say. But what actually convinced him to leave the country was the fact that some of his neighbors came to his house where he was living, and he said that we feel threatened because of your presence, because if something happens to you, our walls are just attached to your house, and it's something that we would suffer as well. So this was like a moral obligation that he felt on himself, and ultimately, so that was the break point in which he decided to shift from here. So this is how things have been doing in the last so many years.
And it looks like it did not stop him from spreading his message and influencing thousands, millions of, unknown number of Muslims in the world. I mean, even on my Facebook, I'm friends with a lot of people who follow Professor Javed Ahmad Ghamidi. And even in the Discord group I'm in, I mean, he has a lot of people who are very interested in the curriculum, the topics that he talks about, and are very satisfied with his scholarship. Please tell me more about Al-Mawrid Institute. Is it something that he set up after he left Pakistan or while he was in Pakistan?
So Al-Mawrid was actually set up much before he left Pakistan. It was set up in 1983 as a part-time institute, which would teach Islamic studies in the evenings. And then in 1988, it became a full-fledged institute it was like a morning to evening affair. And it was at this time that myself and about 6 or 7 of my colleagues, we got together and we became the teachers and the students at the same time. So we taught what we learned and we learned what we taught. So in 1988, it was made a full-time institute. It was revived. So it started off in 1983 and it continued to 1986, until 1986. And because of some reasons, it had to be discontinued, but it was not actually given up as an institute. It was just put into abeyance. So in 1988, we can say it was revived. And ever since that time, it's functioning. And we have now a presence in various countries as well. So we have the parent institute, of course, in Pakistan. And we have sister organizations, I would say, in Australia, in the US, in Canada, in India, in the UK. And prospects are there for such organizations in Germany and in some other countries. So it's like they're not administratively connected, I would say, in the true sense of the word, but they are more of sister organizations, and they carry forth or carry on with the same mission and objective. And most of these institutes, they offer online education programs, teaching programs, lectures. So we have resident scholars at some of these places. But I would say the basic team of Al-Mawrid today, even today, is in Pakistan and in Pakistan, in Lahore, especially in Lahore, I would say.
Okay. And what are the aims of Al-Mawrid? Like, what are the goals? What is their outlook? What do they hope to achieve with their scholarship?
So I would just take you back slightly in history in order to understand what Al-Mawrid stands for. So this is almost a century ago when the famous theologian and historian Shibli Nomani, who in fact was also a mentor or a teacher of Farahi. He was also there at Aligarh. He was a student, or a student, I would say, or an associate, more of an associate with Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So he was the person who said that we should create a seminary in which traditional as well as modern disciplines should be taught at the same time. And instead of purely making people who are secularists or purely making people who are religious minded, why don't we just combine the two streams, as was the case in our days of glory? So he actually floated this idea, and he founded the Darul Musannifin for this, and Nadwa, another institution he actually was part of. He tried to do that there as well, and then he couldn't succeed. And then we have some of the other some of similar endeavors being undertaken by, for example, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who opened up a similar institute called Darul Irshad, but that didn't go along. And then Farahi himself, when he became part of the Madrasatul Islah, the madrasa, the seminary where Islahi became his student, that too also was a madrasa in which some of the contemporary and modern disciplines as well as traditional disciplines were taught, but it never came up to the mark, I would say, as it was imagined. So these were all, I would say, background endeavors which always inspired Ghamidi that we should still not give hope, not lose hope, and not give up. And we should establish an institute in which traditional disciplines as well as modern disciplines are taught to people who are then able to address in a scholarly way all the issues that relate to Islam, study Islam, teach Islam, or carry out research in Islam, and enlighten people in an academic way. And their the basic methodology would be through encouraging questions and through encouraging debate, through encouraging critical thinking. So this element of critical thinking is something which he nurtured amongst his students. And this was the basic idea behind setting up Al-Mawrid in 1983, that to teach people modern and traditional disciplines, especially the Arabic language, starting off with the Arabic language and going to the ultimate extent by making students study the classical Arabic literature, which is, of course, can only be done once you have 5 or 7 years of very strong grounding in Arabic. So Ghamidi Sahib himself, his own teacher Islahi, and then his own teacher Farahi were very well grounded in classical Arabic literature. So this was something which was the groundwork for the study of the Quran. But language is just a tool. So other than that, subjects like Quran, Hadith, similarly history, Bible, they became part of the syllabus. So we even had classes for one time. I just mentioned one of the classes which I taught in 1999. But then that teaching was discontinued in a formal way. But later on, we revived it through an informal setup of education. So in the last 5 years, you can see a number of courses being offered in a way that we give certificates to various courses that are offered by the Al-Mawrid organization in Pakistan and its sister organizations, as well as the fact that soon we are also planning to begin a seminary once again in a more formal way, in which people are made to come and study these disciplines in a more thorough way, and then they are given the degree as well from the institute, and they are able to teach this. But before this thing happens, what we have been doing in the last 5 or 10 years is that we are creating that groundwork, and instead of offering it as a composite course of a 5 or 6 year course, it's more of a 6 months or a 3-month course regarding various topics to various students of various ages, so that we are able to introduce ourselves amongst those people who would like to study Islam. And once that introduction is totally complete, we would like to launch a more formal system of Islamic education. So if I sum up what I've just said, I can say that Al-Mawrid basically stands for education and nothing else.
Okay, that's amazing. And what modern disciplines are you teaching? Because when I hear modern disciplines, I'm wondering, are they things like biology, or do you mean like modern disciplines such as what's currently being researched in the religion? such as what you might find in Western academia?
So, no, I would say that disciplines, for example, like philosophy, anthropology, sociology, and some social sciences as well, like politics and economics. So, the basics of governance. Similarly, as I said, sociology. So, these modern disciplines, which are now part of any person's, I mean, what I can say in a more detailed way is that these are the subjects which form a bedrock or a background. Then there comes this particular time when a person would specialize. So of course he would specialize in some branch of Islamic studies, but at the same time he will have a very strong grounding of all these contemporary social sciences subjects, which are essential for any scholar of Islam to address issues, and of course at the same time come in conversation with all various people who would like to understand the connection between some of the questions which religion solves or gives a solution to, and at the same time they are also addressed by other disciplines. So it's like a cross-disciplinary approach in which, for example, the existence of God, if this is something which is tackled by religion, then you know very well that philosophy also has an approach towards this. Psychology also is one of the things that would be studied. So it's like a comparative study vis-a-vis some of the important subjects which relate to religion, and the scholar himself should not just be well versed in what the Quran tells him or the Hadith tells him, but in modern scientific advancements as well.
And from my reading of the Quran, it seems like that is where it kind of leads you towards, to learn what's out in the world, look at what's around you, study the creation of God. And
Right.
our early scholars, as you mentioned in our glory days, used to do that. You hardly see a religious scholar just focusing on religion and not focusing on anything else. But
Absolutely.
somewhere down the line, it seems like we lost that. So, is it safe
Yes.
to say that the Muslims of the past had more freedom and liberty in their intellectual pursuits than they do today? Specifically in Muslim majority countries, would you say that's a fair assessment?
I would say so. They had more opportunities because the system of education was different and it was more amalgamated. Actually, what happened is that in the last 2.5 centuries, especially in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, the Dars-e-Nizami, or the famous Nizamuddin course, which is taught in madrasas, it became in vogue. And it specifically, although initially it also had subjects like astronomy, even music was part of, because music was part of mathematics very earlier on. So even music was taught as a subject very earlier on.
Wow.
So philosophy was also there, logic was also there. But most of these disciplines were either taught in a very, I mean, unfriendly to the student way, I would say. And also the fact that the language of this teaching was more of logic, which of course is a different genre in how we teach students. So the style of teaching, the method of teaching, the content of teaching, they all were different. And this is something which of course is one of the reasons that this system needs a tremendous overhaul. Prior to that are the glory days that we were talking about, or we're talking about, are the ones in which we had more freedom, we had more impact on the world. And just as today we go to international universities of the US or UK to study, those were the glory days in which people would come to our universities to study. For example, the Nizamiya University, and we have the Kirwin University in Morocco and the Azhar University in Egypt. So they held that same impact that is held by, for example, Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard today. And I think that education was also given a lot of patronage. And unfortunately, today, religious education has been consigned to a particular sort of people, and they are just managing it. And we don't have any universities, I would say, except very few, of repute, which can be presented as exponents of true Islamic education. So I think this is something which the transformation which has taken place, which has changed the whole scenario significantly.
I'm also starting to notice that here in the West, Muslims are starting to have this, or Muslims have the same mindset that anything outside of what they were raised with, or what already established authority has already said. It's almost like you're leaving the fold of Islam to hold a view contrary. How do you define intellectual freedom and liberty?
I think intellectual freedom and liberty is something in which, I mean, for this, I have the Quran before me telling me so many things. And one of the most significant things is that we are liable before God according to our own understanding of the scripture. The Quran addresses the mind, it addresses our intellect, it tells us to reflect. One of the verses in the Quran, for example, in Surah Mulk, it says regarding people who would ultimately end up in hell, and they would have this conversation, and part of that conversation would be "Law kunna nasma'u aw naqilu ma kunna fi ashabis sa'ir," which means that had we used our intellect and listened, we would not have ended up in this fire of hell, telling us that the use of intellect and the use of your mind is something of paramount importance. And when you say that intellect is of paramount importance, then of course it means that you have to understand what you are being told, you have to interpret, and if you have contesting interpretations of a verse of the Quran or of an issue, then you need to study the reasoning of all these contesting interpretations. And the reasoning which appeals to your own intellect the most is the one that you are liable to follow, and therefore become liable to before God as well. So this is how I define intellectual liberty, and I think that every single Muslim has been given this freedom of expression and thought by the Almighty Himself, that he is not bound by the interpretation of any person by blindly following that person and telling God ultimately that, well, this is how I thought. Yes, of course, there are people who might be of such sort that they are not able to, I mean, they don't have the time maybe, or not the time I would say, but they don't have the wherewithal or the intellect to go into the nitty gritties, and they do trust certain scholars. But this cannot be an excuse for scholars themselves. So the biggest thing which plagues our Muslim education, Muslim Islamic education, I would say, is the concept of taqleed or blind following, which means that if you're born a Hanafite, you will die a Hanafite. If you're born a Hanbalite, you'll die a Hanbalite, even if the arguments of the opposite sect or the opposite group would appeal to you. So it's basically that concept of intellectual stagnation that has crept up in our minds, in which people are made to, they are indoctrinated with the fact that it's not that the reasoning of a particular interpretation that needs to be followed. No, it's an imam that you need to follow, and that imam, whatever he says, you just cannot differ with him, and you have to just blindly follow him, and that's the end of that. So we stand for this intellectual liberty, that all imams are our own imams, all scholars are our own scholars. We will not differentiate between them. You will study all of them. We'll make it a point to study the reasoning of each one of them. But after studying them, we will be the ones who would decide which one is more convincing to our own intellect. And if this question which arises, which should automatically arise, is that how can every person do that when he himself is not a scholar? Well, the answer to that is that how do we do it in the case of two doctors when we decide for a better doctor and we ourselves are not a doctor? If I go to a cardiologist for my heart operation, I'm not a cardiologist myself, but if I interview 3 or 4 cardiologists who are going to operate upon me, I can tell very well after a good conversation that who would I like to trust. So in a very similar way, we would advise people, scholars especially, that they should study every single person, every single scholar. And of course, on a particular issue, there are not more than 3 or 4 opinions. And the opinion that we need to follow is not the one of the sect that we belong to. In fact, we should not belong to any sect. We are Muslims. So we would tell them that we should regard every single celebrated scholar to be our heritage. He belongs to our heritage. But we would follow him if we are able to understand his reasoning and we find his reasoning to be convincing.
Okay, so Al-Mawrid Institute is basically a non-sectarian institution. No slant one way or the other. You guys
Right.
study everything and draw
Yep.
the best conclusion from all of that. That's amazing.
Gee.
That's why I started my YouTube channel. At first, I started with, yes, more traditional outlooks, but then I started incorporating views from Western academia, research from elsewhere, to just have a better understanding and a holistic perspective of Islam, the religion, and history. Um, Sorry. But do you feel intellectual liberty or freedom and liberty have its limits? If they do, what are they?
The limits, of course, are something which reasoning itself would tell us. It's like something that when you argue, I mean, of course, if we believe in the Quran, if we think that the Quran is the word of God, so the limit is that you have to regard the Quran to be the ultimate source of everything. It should prevail over everything. But you see, the Quran is not always, verses of the Quran don't always have the same interpretation regarding the scholars themselves. So to us, the ultimate limit is the text of the Quran. So you just cannot go beyond the text of the Quran. The interpretation of the text is something that we are at liberty to do, but disregarding the text of the Quran or disregarding the Sunnah of the Prophet is something that cannot be done. So we would operate within the confines of the Quran and Sunnah, and we just cannot say that if there is something which the Quran says, and we out of our own intellect would say, well, this is something that doesn't convince me, and I would go for something else. So that is something that I personally would not go for, and I don't think any of us would. So within the confines of the Quran and Sunnah, we would regard ourselves, I mean, all of us would regard these two sources to be the sources of Islam. And all that now remains is the interpretation part. So there are some interpretations which are absolutely explicit and there's absolutely no difference of opinion about them. And it's a very major part of Islam. So there's no issue there. But wherever there's a difference of opinion, it will be the Quran which prevails on all interpretations.
Okay, and one group that I've noticed having emerged in recent times, they've probably always been there, but given social media, they have a huge platform nowadays, are Quranists, or people who practice Quranism, they reject the Hadith.
Right.
What if their intellect or the intellectual freedom and liberty they had led them to that conclusion? I guess my question is, what is your view on Quranism? Is there any basis for it
right.
from the Quran, or
I
is this
think
just...
it has arisen. It has arisen because we have not made a distinction between the Sunnah and the Hadith. So Hadith, of course, is something which are isolated reports from the Prophet, and which have as scholars say, يحتمل الصدق والكذب, that can be true and they can be false. And because of the fact that people regard Hadith to be infallible, so therefore the Quranists have emerged from this notion that there are so many hadiths which cannot be trusted, and of course they are. I do believe that as well. So when you regard the same sanctity to hadith as the Quran, they out of their own reaction say, well, this is not correct, because there are so many hadiths which are spurious or which have content which goes against the Quran. So probably the point or the missing link is that when the Prophet gave religion, or the original sources, I would say, if I rephrase my answer, the original sources of Islam, of course, are the Quran and Sunnah. And Sunnah is not what Hadith is. Sunnah is the established practice of Prophet Abraham. In fact, we can go one step behind, and we can, as my teacher puts it, that the source of religion is Prophet Muhammad's own person, his own person. So from him, we got a religion in the form of the Quran and the Sunnah. Of course, we know what the Quran is. By Sunnah is meant the established practice of the Prophet Abraham. So like the rituals of Hajj and Umrah and all those worship rituals are something that we got from Sunnah. And exactly the way in which the Quran was transmitted and rendered it safe and secure was the same in which the Sunnah was also transmitted, what we call as ijma and tawatur. So just as the Quran was transmitted through the consensus and tawatur, or perpetual adherence, similarly the Sunnah, the only difference was that the Quran was transmitted through oral tawatur and the Sunnah through practical tawatur. But Hadith is something, it's a different genre, it's a different thing, and it was never transmitted through consensus or through a large number of people, but by few people, and that too according to their own understanding. So I think the Quranists have emerged because of the fact that our traditional scholars, they insist upon the Quran and Hadith as equal sources of knowledge of Islam. And because they found out that Hadith cannot be a source, so by, in fact, negating the Hadith, they also ended up negating the Sunnah as well. And I also think that this whole concept, if you argue with the Quranists, you might be even able to convince them if you make this case that basically Quran and Sunnah are the infallible sources. As far as Hadith is concerned, it is not an infallible source. It is something which can be correct, which can be evaluated and critically understood. But the Sunnah, which is the established practice of Prophet Abraham, and the Quran, they are the two infallible sources. I think if this case is presented before them, they might even understand and accept the Sunnah as a basis. But because the Sunnah has never become distinct from Hadith, and it is always, presented within the content of Hadith, and it's just jumbled up. So what, in fact, is brought up from the discourse of our traditional scholars is that the source of Islam is Quran and Hadith, and by Hadith, of course, is to them is something which are these isolate reports that we find in Bukhari or Muslim. So I would say that the Quranists they have arisen actually because of the fact that people have started to give Hadith the same status, or maybe something very near the Quran. And it was more of I can say, not in the literal sense, but some sort of a reaction to that. And had this not happened, and the actual presentation had been made before them, that basically it is the Quran and the Sunnah, that is what Islam is. And as far as Hadith is concerned, it cannot be a source of Islam because it is something which can only explain what the sources are. And that too, if it is proven through criticism and, critical historical methods.
Have you seen the latest MBS interview with, I believe it's Al Arabiya?
Yes, I have seen parts of it.
Okay, yeah, probably the part that everybody's talking about. How do you feel about him? I believe foregoing the Ahad narrations concerning implementing laws in the kingdom.
I think that is something very close to what I would also go for, if I understood him correctly, because there have been various versions of his interview. So what if he's implying this fact that Hadith cannot be made a source of law? If this is what I have roughly understood. And if my understanding is correct, I would go along with him, and I would say, of course, that it cannot be made a source of law because it is something which the Prophet never intended to transmit. It was basically an endeavor of the Sahaba themselves. So you see, the Prophet made it an obligation upon himself to transmit the Quran and to transmit the Sunnah. For this, he took great pains. He asked his companions to transmit the Sunnah and the Quran, but he never did so for Hadith because it was more of a situational question that people would ask for him, or he would comment on a thing. And because the Sahaba, they thought that they have learned something very wise and something other people could really make use of. So out of their own volition, out of their own urge, they started to transmit these reports to others. It's like sitting in the company of a very learned person, and if you find something very useful, you say, well, why should I not spread this to other people? So it was basically something, what I'm trying to say is that it's not the fact, as people think, that the Prophet himself sat down every day and he would start teaching Hadith and he would tell them, well, this is how I explain things and now you should transmit this. This never happened. And this would be a wrong interpretation of things as they went on. So basically, Hadith came into being through either a question being asked in isolation from the Prophet, or the Prophet may be commenting on something that came to his notice. And the people who were there, they thought that, well, this is something that other people need to know. So this is how Hadith sprang. Therefore, if this is the correct way, then you can see clearly that there could be instances in which people could misunderstand what the Prophet might have said, or as is the case, that they would chance by a Prophet entering into conversation, and they were actually listening to the conversation between the Prophet and some of the Sahaba, and by not actually entering at the right time, they would just catch the part that was there at that time, and they would just pick up that part conversation and then report it. So these were some of the things which marred the narration or the transmission of Hadith. And if you understand this process, no sane person, I would say, would ever think that Hadith can be made a basis of law.
Interesting, because reading his book on Hadith by Dr. Jonathan Brown, he had mentioned that some Sahaba, upon their death, had burned what they had written down out of fear that it would fall into the wrong hands and be misinterpreted. As well as, I'm sorry, you mentioned another point that was just right in my brain that I didn't want to. Oh, yes, and Abu Huraira, it seems like in some narrations that he might have walked in at the wrong time while the Prophet was
Right.
narrating hadith and misunderstood it. Just from reading some words from Aisha and Umar, reprimanding him for the way that he was transmitting it.
That is absolutely correct. And so he just was a companion of the Prophet for 4 or 5 years in the last years of his life. And he is the person who has transmitted the most number of hadiths. And you'll see, technically, if you read through his hadiths, that he never mentions that he heard a lot of things that he reported directly from the Prophet. So he would, the hadiths would generally start by the words, An Abi Huraira, Qala Qala Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, which means that the Prophet said this. And you'll seldom hear him reporting Sami'tu or Sami'na, or things that I heard from the Prophet, or we heard from the Prophet, or Akhbarani or Haddasani. Most of the time he would say Qala, which means that he said, and would not specify whether he himself heard it or he heard it from someone else and then started reporting it. And then there are a number of things in his narrations which have come under scrutiny from various contemporary scholars as well. The Egyptian school, of course, of Rashid Raza and his contemporaries, and many other researchers have shown that a lot of problematic hadiths are the ones which have been actually reported by Abu Huraira.
I also came across something that Abu Huraira might have been a pen name for some hadith. Might have been used as a pen name for some people. I'm also starting to know. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, because this question might take us somewhere else, but I would like for you to finish what you were going to say.
So I just said that, you see, there are this amount of sanctity which has been attached to Abu Huraira. Radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, of course, he was a Sahabi. So, but the fact is, you see, merely because a person is narrating a large volume of hadith does not make him infallible in any way, or a person who has to be trusted in all cases. And we are not doubting his intention. You see, what we are saying is that he heard something and he thought sincerely that he should transmit it, and at times his assessment was not correct, and at times whatever he reported, I mean, we hear Abu Huraira not directly, but of course through so many other mediums which lived after him, so many other narrators. So a lot of things who he narrated have reached the compilers of hadith through 3 or 4 narrators in between. And again, those narrators, they are also people who need to be thrashed out and evaluated. So all in all, what we are saying is that whether it is Abu Huraira or any other narrator, hadith can never be infallible. And this is also the classical stance, yahtamilu sidq wal kizb, which means that it could yield truth and it could yield falsity at the same time. We need to evaluate it. And because of the fact that in the last, I would say, 150 years or so, there has been this movement towards hadith, and people like Ibn Hazm or Dawood Zahiri and a new group of people which have emerged in the last couple of centuries, and they call them Ahlul Hadith. They are the ones who have seemingly dominated even people who are more based on the views, for example, of Abu Hanifa or some of his contemporaries or his teachers or students like Imam Malik, who had a different approach towards hadith. And what has happened is in the last 250 years, the Ahlul Hadith approach or the hadith-centered approach has started to dominate. And as a result of that, we find, criticism on hadith is not very welcomed in Islamic circles, in spite of the fact that there have been scholarly criticisms on Bukhari. For example, Imam Dar Qutni, living about 150 years after him or 200 years after him, he severely criticized some of his traditions, and there have been other people after him, and even in our contemporary times. But the fact is that the Imam Bukhari's Al-Jami' al-Sahih, and in fact the 6 canonical collections, they have somehow been given a status which is, if not equal to the Quran, it's not even less than the Quran. So it's like that Ahlul Hadith approach which has dominated, and it is still dominating. And that is why we find there's a lot of discussion going on between the Quranists and the Ahlul Hadith people.
So you would disagree
we stand with none of them. So we have a different approach for both. So neither are we Quranists nor are we Ahlul Hadith. As I said, our stance is that Quran and Sunnah is something which is at times equated with hadith. No, sunnah is the established practice of the Prophet. As I gave you the example, the rituals of Islam, for example, they were transmitted through established tawatur. And if you can count, if you start counting the sunnah practices, you can count them on your fingers. So my own mentor, actually, in his book Mizan, which is a comprehensive treatise on Islam, he has enumerated those acts of sunnah and counted them, that they come to this total. So they are basically practices, and they have been transmitted as safely and as securely as the Quran itself. And they are absolutely distinct from hadith.
Okay. So you wouldn't agree with the statement that we read the Quran through the hadith, more so the opposite way around?
Absolutely not. I would say it is the other way around. In order to understand hadith, we need the Quran.
Okay. Because, I read that from a reputable hadith scholar who's a Muslim.
I know, because this is the dominant approach. As I said, the dominant approach is hadith-centric, and the basis, the first impact that this hadith-centric approach has is that the Quran has to be understood through hadith. You just cannot understand the Quran yourself. You're not equipped sufficiently. And only the Prophet could have understood this. Now, notwithstanding the fact that we have very seldom or very few explanations of Quranic verses from the Prophet himself. Most of these explanations are from the Tabi'un or the Sahaba, very few from the Sahaba even. But if you pick up Tabari, for example, you'll find the Tabi'un, the third in line from the Prophet. They are the ones you'll find being copiously quoted regarding the interpretation of a Quranic verse. Very few from the Prophet, very few. And of course, not much from the Sahaba as well, but a lot from the Tabi'un.
Yeah, I came across that in the early schools before Shafi'i, it was more common for hadiths to stop at a tabi'un or sometimes the Sahaba more so than the Prophet, which explains why if you read Abu Hanifa's Kitab al-Athar, you don't see too many hadiths going back to the Prophet. Same thing with Imam Malik's Muwatta and early books of hadith.
Right.
Sorry, I had just one more question. Not one more question. But I'm starting to notice that more and more Muslims are under the assumption that we should revisit, revision, and reform Islam. Are you also in line with that thought?
Well, I think this is something which is a natural outcome of human error and human intellectual deficiency in interpretation of the Quran. You see, the text of the Quran is something which is infallible, but interpreting the text is a human endeavor. And because a human endeavor can never be fault-free, so there is always a chance to revisit the interpretation. So I would say that the revisitation of Islamic thought is something which has to be there. It's like an ongoing process. You need to continuously understand the text, and when you do so, you might realize that whatever interpretation has already been offered, you find you are very comfortable with it, and you think it's absolutely correct. And then there could be this question that might arise in your mind, and you feel dissatisfied, and maybe because of that dissatisfaction, you research and you come up with a new interpretation. But again, whatever the interpretation, if it is backed by sound reasoning, that is how we should progress. So the question that you asked was that if I'm for it, yes, of course I'm for it, because you see, human interpretation can never be infallible. And if something has been interpreted by someone who could be a great authority, again, because of the fact that that authority is not God himself or the Prophet himself, the possibility of error is always there. And therefore, we need to always reflect and keep on reflecting on the Quran. Either we'll end up corroborating what has already been interpreted, or maybe we'll be interpreting it in a new way. But as far as these interpretations are concerned, they are all governed by a specific hermeneutic. And that hermeneutic is, of course, something that different scholars can apply and come up with different results. And again, that is because, as Farai once put it, either it is because of lack of knowledge or of lack of reflection. Qillatu tadabbur or qillatu ilm, these are his words, that either at the time of interpretation, you are not sufficiently equipped with the knowledge that is needed, or at the time you might have the knowledge, but it's not always that you're applying yourself fully, because as a human error part, there is always this option or this chance that you are not fully concentrating and something is missing, and another person can come along and point it out. So this is something of a obvious corollary of human intellectual deficiency, which can never be perfect.
Unfortunately, I see a lot of reluctance from scholars in the
Mm.
West engaging such an idea. I mean, even myself, I've talked to a few scholars that I know about the biography of the Prophet or some concerns I had with Hadith, and they just totally just kind of shooed me away, and one just really just stopped talking to me altogether. It's very disheartening from for a practitioner like myself to be met with such resistance. What
Mhm.
role do you believe dialogue plays in trying to revisit, revision, and reform? Because it seems like without any dialogue, some Muslims who are just practitioners are left to figure these things out. And I've even come across some who weren't met or didn't find sufficient answers and just ended up leaving.
You see, dialogue is only possible if people are willing to engage in dialogue. And I'm talking particularly regarding Islamic scholars. You see, unless they are willing to engage and revisit, what happens is that you keep talking to them and your words just come back to you. And because of the fact that they have been trained that there should be no dialogue, whatever has been interpreted once and for all in the sect that they have been born in, that is the ultimate interpretation of the Quran. So therefore, there is no room for any dialogue. So if you're talking about dialogue with scholars, I find it to be non-existent and also a virtual impossibility because of their non-willingness to enter into a dialogue. And they would always criticize it and say that, well, what is the need when things have already been settled? And if you're talking about dialogue with the new generation or people who are open to dialogue, then yes, absolutely, this is the way forward, because there are so many questions today which young Muslims face from their own contemporaries, or they arise within their own minds when they traverse the terrain of life, and when they come in contact with their professors or with their own environment. So things which crop up in their own minds. So if you hush them to sleep, that's not the way out, and that's not an academic approach. So I think, yes, the only way forward regarding the younger generation and all those people who are open to dialogue, even if religious scholars are open, if somehow they are convinced to open up themselves, then yes, that is the only way forward, because that is how people will come and ask questions, engage in debate, and once they are satisfied, they'll find religion to be a part of their heart, a part of their soul. Because you see, once you're convinced of something, intellectually convinced, you'll follow it in a very diligent way. You'll follow it in a very emotional and in a way that you would really feel as if you are connected to God. But if you follow it out of emotions without understanding it, just going blindly about it, you'll never have that deep God connection, because things will be virtually more of of a sort of a machine oriented, because you are not understanding what is being said. All you're doing is just following it like a part of a machine that is just revolving around or doing its own job. So that is the only way forward. And one of the areas that Al-Mawrid stands for is that effective dialogue between all parties concerned who would like to enter into dialogue, who would like to debate things, who would like to understand things. And one other thing that I'd like to stress here is that we enter into a dialogue. The purpose is not to dominate the other person or to prove him to be wrong. No, the purpose is to humbly state whatever you think is your view in a very uh, unemphatic manner, in emphatic manner, not emphasizing it or not imposing it, but telling the other person that this is how I understand, and I may be wrong in my understanding, and I'd like to know your view. So yes, dialogue, and in a way that is very humble, in a way that you not force your opinion on the other person, you not impose your opinion. All that you do is you present your own view with the reasoning that you have understood, and let the other person understand it or even reject it. So it's not like dominating the other person. It's like educating one another and following whatever one is comfortable with.
Okay, thank you. And how do you feel about Orientalism? I'm starting to notice that more Muslims either just reading Orientalist work casually concerning Islam, and I'm also starting to see more Muslims enter into Western academia for Islamic studies. How do you feel about Orientalism? Some scholars are very anti Orientalism. They see it as an imperialistic endeavor or work done by missionaries. But I tend to find I find the work to be not legit all the time, but I find it to be sound work in some areas, and it can give Muslims something to enrich our understanding about our history, and not so much our practices in our religion, but more so our history and background.
So there have been several phases of Orientalism, I would say, starting off with, I mean, it began about so many years ago with the translation of the Quran in different languages. If you trace it back to the last 6 or 7 centuries, so there have been various stages. I'm not going to go into detail because these stages have their own distinct features. But the latest wave of intellectualism and Orientalism, which I can say spans the last 50 years or maybe a last century even, roughly, I would say 50 to 70 years. And I've been in touch with all sorts of scholars, and I've read their works as well. I have found almost all of them to be very, very intellectually honest. They don't have an agenda of their own. They are more concerned of what the truth is. They'd like to find out what the truth is. They might not be convinced of it, but they still have that passion to find it out. And so I have found them to be pretty engaging, pretty honest, and very thorough. And I would especially point out the Germans in this regard, German Orientalists. They are extremely thorough, extremely methodical, very, very painstaking in their research, and very, very honest as well. And I think that is sufficient. So instead of finding any hidden agenda in their work, the best thing, as they say, that the proof of the pudding lies in its eating. So you just need to go through the works of these people and the arguments that they put forth. So you'll find them putting forth whatever Muslims have presented in their own books. It's not that they're fabricating their own agenda or putting forth things from our own mouths. No, what they generally do is they pick up things from tafsir books or hadith books or fiqh books from within the Muslims, and then they start evaluating them and criticizing them or telling them that, well, how can the two things be true at the same time when they seem to contradict? So basically, their approach is more of a historical source approach in which they would evaluate a lot of things out of their, out of their own branch of knowledge that they are in. And although we find that the various approaches that they have followed, you might not agree with them. For example, the approach of Joseph Schacht or Goldziher, or some of his contemporaries in this, or some of their followers in this era, in which they outright reject hadith or history or regard it to be a total fabrication. That is something that we might not agree on. But again, this is how we would disagree, or this is how we would tell them that these are arguments for disagreeing with them. But doubting their intentions or telling them that they have simply an agenda to wipe out Islamic thought or something like that, I would not go along with that in any way.
Yeah, because what I'm starting to see is that they confirm many of what Muslims already believe about their religion. With what you mentioned, they bring forth a whole bunch of previous opinions or what other scholars have said, even if they contradict, and they present them. And it just kind of opens Muslims up to a wider variety of thinking than what I was used to when I first converted, being told that, hey, there's only a couple opinions on this, and that's
right.
it. Well, who do you believe? Who should define the boundaries for religious beliefs?
Could you be more specific in your question?
Okay, yes. What I see in a lot of Muslim countries, as like what you mentioned, it seems like religious education is under the power of the government. Do you believe that the government or a certain authority of that, an authority such as that, should define the boundaries of what is within or without out of the religion? Basically, like should they be the ones to enforce blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, going back to what they feel is within boundaries of religion and outside? Should that be the power of the state? And if not, who should have that power?
So I think there is a balance which has been created, and that is that the interpretation can only be done by people who are competent. For example, blasphemy laws or hudud laws or any other interpretation, that of course will be done by concerned scholars. What government would do is that these laws or these interpretations would be debated in the parliament, and whichever interpretation of a particular verse of the Quran, if it is operational regarding a directive that has to be implemented. For example, let's take the example of hudud laws or even blasphemy laws. So there are different interpretation of these blasphemy laws by different scholars. So what will happen is in the parliament, some of these scholars would be invited to and they would be asked to have a debate, or some of their opinions would be floated amongst the parliamentarians who are the basic representatives of the state, and they will either discuss the views which are presented by these scholars, or they will study them and then give preference to one of the views. So the way legislation would be done is that the interpretation, of course, is being done independently of the parliament or the government by various scholars. This has always been taking place in the last 14 centuries. Scholars are going about it out of their own urge. What will happen is that at the state level, a particular legislation will be discussed in the parliament, and whichever legislation enjoys the majority of the parliament will become law. And it's not necessary that that law will be exactly the true interpretation. That is the operational and functional interpretation, or the majority interpretation. And until the time there is another opinion which emerges to defeat this majority opinion, till that time, that law would be implemented, and people would be allowed to even differ with it and present their differences, because this is how in a democratic rule and in a Muslim rule, people would be allowed to do so in bounds. And this is precisely how they might end up in majority with their own views. But as long as that law is operational, it would be incumbent upon to follow it. So they would follow the rule of the majority, but at the same time, given this freedom and liberty to criticize it without not following it. And if ever they come in majority, I mean the opposing view, then obviously it will enjoy the support of the majority. And so it will be the majority who would decide. And when I say majority, of course, I refer to the parliament, because parliament itself is composed of the representatives of the state. So basically, it is this forum which will be the ultimate decision-making body regarding the implementation of legislature or things which relate to Islamic law.
Okay, so from what I take from that is that you believe consensus is not a fixed thing, and that it can change based on time and region depending on the situation.
For first, I can tell you that there is no consensus on the definition of consensus. Ijma itself is something which lacks any consensus, and scholars like Ahmad bin Hanbal have reported to have said that man idda'al ijma faqad kazab or faqad kafar. Anyone who claims that there is an ijma on a certain thing is not correct. So I think there is no such thing as ijma, because ijma in itself is nothing. All that we have is the Quran and the Sunnah, and of course the practices of the Prophet which have been transmitted. And all that we need to do is that interpretations which already exist. I mean, we are not living in a new era. We are living with the 14th century background. So obviously, for example, divorce laws or marriage laws or punishments or so many other things, they already have been interpreted in these 14th centuries, and they're already people already know about them. So the question here is that which of them should be made law? So law is that part which would, when floated in the parliament, I mean, it would relate to the collective affairs, but in those areas only which relate to that collectivity. And again, as I said, that in the case of nation states, this would again be there would be another question, that this law would be solely for Muslims. And as if nation states like Pakistan or many other countries which have so many other religions, so laws which are specifically related to religion, the minorities would not be allowed to. I mean, they would not. These laws would not be enforced upon them, because the Islamic part of these laws is only related to people who follow Islam.
Yes. How do you reconcile Islamic principles in a secular democracy? That's one of the biggest things I hear, biggest contentions I hear from non-Muslims. They feel that Islam is opposed to democracy.
I think there is no such thing as a secular democracy. I think all that we can say is democracy. Democracy means that people who are members of the parliament, of course, they are Muslims. So when they assume their position in the parliament, they will judge their affairs, and they will pass laws which relate to Islam, and in their position, they are expected to in all areas where Islam has spoken or given us a rule, they would give it importance. And if they are not doing so, then again, the problem is not with them. The problem is with the elected, with the whole electoral college. I mean, people who are electing them. So if people are electing people who are not conversant with Islam or they are not very sincere with Islam, so it's not by forcing Islam from the top that anything is going to happen. Then all that is going to be needed in the first place is that we should educate the society. So it's like a bottom-up approach, not a top-down approach, in which if you would like Islam to be there in the society, you need to educate people regarding Islam. And some of those people are going to get elected, reach the parliament. And if they are well educated on Islam, they would always like the collective aspect of Islam to be prevalent in the society. So I would say that if you bring the society in line with this notion that people who are going to be elected are the ones who are going to run the affairs, should be the ones who should be trained properly as good Muslims. So that is how things should actually shape up. Anything else, if we adopt, that would be more of forcing something or maybe using some force to implement something. So Islam says, Amruhum Shura Bainahum. So that is a very important verse of the Quran, which means that the system of their state is based on their consultation. And it does not define this, the word them. It does not say, well, they have to be graduates or they have to be Islamic scholars. No, it says them, whoever they are, whoever their citizens are, whatever their education, it is based on their consultation. So if you want to make them better people, educate them better, you'll get better parliamentarians, you'll get better people who will get elected. So you structure the society in a way that you get better people in the parliament. But other than that, if you adopt any other means, that would more be, in the first case, it would not perhaps even possible. But in the second case, the only thing that Muslims do have as a vision in their mind is, for example, a coup which some party would make and just grapple the reins of power, just get hold of them through a revolution or something, and just get hold of the government or the authority, and then start implementing Islamic laws. This is not how things work. I mean, this is not what the Quran says. And because the model which has been adopted by the Prophet himself, when he was actually, when he migrated to Medina and when he made pacts with the Jewish tribes, and of course, wars were fought. So that maybe that's a topic for another day, that how the Prophet himself, there were certain specific rules that he was bound to obey as a messenger of God, which we as, I mean, people who are living in the post-prophetic era, and we of course are not messengers of God, we're just ordinary Muslims. So there are certain laws of God which relate specifically to those messengers and not to us. And once they have passed away, they don't have any bearing on us. So because the Quran also mentions those laws, what has happened is that sometimes the model which was made by the Prophet, or the way the Prophet conducted his ministry, is made a model that we need to follow exactly in replica. And therefore, people like Osama bin Laden or Mullah Omar or their likes, or Abu Bakr Baghdadi, they think that if the Prophet waged wars for such and such a purpose, so in following him, because he is a golden example, his Uswa Hasana is something that we have to follow. So what we are doing is, if he implemented certain laws in a certain way, or the Quran also gave him permission to kill the disbelievers or to strike off their necks, etc., then we too have the same privilege or prerogative. So it is by not understanding the fact that there are certain prerogatives which are specific to God's messengers and which cannot be carried forth after him to other ordinary people. And this is how I think the whole issue has been jumbled up in Muslim politics. And people who think that there is a secular democracy which is against Islam, this is because they don't give the same interpretation to this verse of Surah Shura, which says, Amruhum Shura Bainahum, which means that the rule of the majority would be the one which has to prevail. And they do not interpret this verse in this meaning. What they do is they actually interpret this verse in the meaning in which another verse of what they think is a similar verse of Surah Al Imran, which means, which actually is of the words are, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ, which means that you do take consultation, but you are not bound by their majority, whatever they say. You consult people, but Whatever you think is correct, ultimately you do that. And they don't probably take this into account that that verse has been addressed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So to him, of course, taking consultation and then deciding out of his own was absolutely warranted because he was behaving as a messenger of God. But amruhum shura bainahum, the way it stands today in the Quran, it has no link with this verse or shawirhum fil amr. It independently tells us that the system of state is based on consultation, which means that if there is a difference of opinion, then the opinion of the majority will prevail.
How do you go about distinguishing between verses meant specifically for the Prophet and the verses meant for us as Muslims for all time?
The best thing is to study that particular area in context. I mean, it's nothing that you need to do outside. There's no principle involved here. It's all the context which governs us, which tells us, for example, the verses of the Quran tell us that the messengers of God are bound to prevail. They have been given this authority that a messenger, once he arrives on the face of the earth, he's a representative of God, and God creates a lesser day of judgment in his times. He distinguishes the believers and disbelievers, and the disbelievers, they are either totally wiped off if they are polytheists, or they are kept on their own religion and they're kept alive, for example, if they are monotheists. Or this is, for example, for what happened in the times of Prophet Muhammad. So therefore, the Jews and the Christians were told that if they would like to adhere to their own religion, they are free to do so by giving jizya and living in subservience. But the idolaters who professed polytheism, idolatry, they were not given this chance. So you can clearly see that people to whom a messenger of God is sent, he, as a representative of God, delivers the truth to such an ultimate extent to those disbelievers that they don't have any excuse to deny it. And the Quran calls this as itmamul hujjah, which means conclusive communication of the truth. And the Quran at many places tells us, the words are, for example, yarifunahu kama yarifuna abnahum, or kafaru bima arafu. I mean, they denied the messenger or denied the truth after they became convinced of it. So it was something in the era of the prophets of God that this deliberate denial could be understood. And the prophet or the messenger himself was not the person who could gauge that. The Almighty, through his divine revelation, would tell the prophet that, well, such and such a group now has no excuse to deny the truth. They are now denying the truth intentionally, and now therefore they have to be taken to task. So wherever there is this conclusive element of truth being discussed in the Quran, we know that the Almighty is telling his messengers that on his behalf, he is the one who is informing his messengers that, well, this and this group does not need any, does not merit any lenience because they are now guilty of deliberate denial. So in the absence of a messenger of God, although even today people are deliberately denying, but we have no knowledge of them because divine revelation no longer comes to us. And in the times of God's messengers, he communicated this deliberate denial to his messengers, and this cannot happen today. So therefore, a lot of things which were operational in the time of prophets of God, in which these lesser days of judgment were actually created, can no longer happen. And therefore, regarding all non-Muslims of today, our attitude towards them has to be absolutely congenial, absolutely accommodating. We need to present ourselves as exponents of whatever we stand for and let them think for themselves. But this opportunity was not there in the times of God's messengers, because God said that in those times, he was the one who was actually delivering the truth through his messengers. And for any deliberate denial, a punishment would be done in this very world. So for those people, those days it was like having days of judgment for the case of each messenger. Just as we're going to have a greater day of judgment one day, so these lesser days of judgment took place in the times and the eras of each of these messengers of God, and which after their passing away no longer take place. So in our own times, our judgment has been deferred to the day of judgment. But in their times, their judgment took place in this very world. So this is the stark difference, which, if understood, will make you understand a lot of verses in the Quran, how impactful they are or have a different impact. And in fact, I have a publication on this, which is called Playing God, Misreading a Divine Practice, which actually tries to explain this very aspect of the Quran, that how there are certain specific verses which relate to God's messengers, and how if they are erroneously extended into the era beyond Prophet Muhammad's era, they will result in people doing things which are only and only stipulated for God's messengers, and which has actually been done.
You're 100% correct. I wish I had found out about you when I first converted, because I was under the impression that everything in the Quran is meant for all time, and we were supposed to apply it the same way the Prophet did. And it's interesting that you brought up the concept of a lesser and greater day of judgment. It seems like in the Quran, the Prophet Yunus and the Prophet Muhammad's people were the only people who kind of survived
Right.
that, and everybody else were met with destruction.
Right.
So going back a little bit, jizya isn't something that is supposed to be applied in this time. It was specifically meant for the people who they didn't reject the prophet. They were from different religious communities. They didn't accept the Prophet Muhammad, but they submitted. I don't want to explain this incorrectly, but yeah. So jizya isn't something we should apply now, but more so back then.
So jizya was only meant for the people of the book of the times of the Prophet, on whom the truth had been unveiled to the ultimate extent. As I just explained, that in the case of messengers of God, the fate of his addressees is divided into two broad categories. People who are polytheists, like the mushrikun, they are wiped out, and so was the case with, for example, the nation of the Prophet Lot, or the Ad, or the Samud, or those ancient nations. But people who are basically monotheists, so the people of the book are basically monotheists. So for them, the punishment of wiping out or the punishment of destruction is not given, and instead the punishment of subservience is given, that they will be allowed to live on their own religion as long as they are willing to live in subservience to an Islamic state. So this is what happened in the times of the Sahaba, right after the Prophet Muhammad. But once they passed away, this unfortunately became a practice of the later rulers as well, that jizya was imposed later on as well. But if you understand it right from the Quran, then it is absolutely evident that it is only meant for those people to whom Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had unveiled the truth in its ultimate form, and who after him survived. Of course, the Prophet left early, but who survived after him. For example, the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. These were the two areas in which the Prophet had already communicated the truth in a certain way. And it was for them that if they had to survive, then for them, the option was that they could remain on their own religion, they could practice Christianity or Judaism, whatever they wanted, but they would have to pay this jizya tax. So it was a sign of subservience and humiliation, basically.
Okay.
And once they had passed away, I mean, once the Sahaba had done their job regarding the states on whom the Prophet had actually delivered the truth, it had no bearing for later countries or later generations.
Okay. And what kind of reconciliatory approach do you believe Muslims here in the West should have towards non-Muslims? Some of them who have certain reservations about Islam and misconceptions.
I think it's a golden opportunity for all Muslims to come closer to non-Muslims, especially the post 9/11 era, in which there is a lot of intrigue amongst non-Muslims. They have a lot of curiosity that how can people die and make other people die? What exactly is wrong with these Muslims? So I think this is the time in which Muslims should present the Quran not as a book for the Muslims, but as a book for humanity. And at the same time, they should study the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the way they study the Quran. So that, you see, when the Quran tells us that you have to believe in all the books of God, it doesn't mean that you have to believe in them blindly. Of course, you can only believe in them when you study them. So when I am required by the Quran to profess faith in all the books of God, what does that mean? To say that these are books of God, and that's all? No, I think it means that you have to actually study those books and have faith in those books, that they are the works of God. The only thing is that they are not now available in their original form. They're all translations. But primarily, except for certain areas where there have been certain interpolations, but broadly you'll find them to be very close to the Quran. So if Muslims start reading if Muslims want to present the Quran as a book for mankind, for humanity, then as a first step, they must reciprocate as well. And they also need to read the Bible, and must not regard the Bible to be a book for the Christians or Jews. it's a book for mankind, just as the Quran is a book for mankind. It's a book for everyone. So I think the way Muslims should behave is that, first of all, this Bible, the rivalry that they have for the Bible, or the thing, and this, by the way, stems from the attitude of our scholars. And I, in one of my publications, which is called Selections from the Bible, I have written a small note regarding the attitude of Muslims, which has arisen because of a certain hadith in which the Prophet is reportedly have said to Umar that you must not read the Bible, etc. And I actually argued that the hadith itself is not authentic, and because of the hadith, it has shaped our Muslim attitude, in which no one is willing to even touch the Bible. I mean, not even go near it, let alone read it. And this has been the attitude of our scholars, and it has been passed down toward the common man. So they are ill-educated about the Bible, I would say. So the best thing is that all the divine books of God, in whatever form they are available, they should be read together. They should be read in groups. They should be read as if they are all books of God. The only edge which the Quran holds, and it's of course a big edge, and that is that it is preserved in its original language, which of course the Bible is not. But that doesn't mean that all of it has been corrupted, or all of it has been just changed. No, only a few parts of it have been changed. And if you read the Bible in the light of the Quran, you'll find out to be such, there's such a great similarity that a lot of Bible scholars were actually tempted to say that the Quran is a distorted version of the Bible itself, because they have similar stories. So I think that the only way out is that Muslims should have those scripture reading sessions of all these divine scriptures together. And instead of policing non-Muslims, and instead of showing animosity to them, and instead of quoting verses like La tattakhidhul yahuda wan nasara awliya, which means that you cannot make the Jews and the Christians your friends, they should try to understand that these verses again were meant for the Jews and Christians of the times of the Prophet of God, who had intentionally denied the truth. And as a punishment for this intentional denial, Muslims were told that they should not make friends with them. This is not the case with today's Jews and Christians. So the Jews and Christians of the Quran, they are specific. They are very specific. And they must not be analogously related to the Jews and Christians of today. And this is a very huge difference, which, if understood with its correct background, will lead Muslims to an entirely new approach. And that approach would be to sit together with their brethren, to talk to them, to attend their functions, to meet them, and meet them in a way that they would meet their own Muslim friends, regard them to be good human beings, not be judgmental about them. So, this is like a 360-degree shift, or a 180-degree shift, I would say. It's like a totally opposite stance that Muslims should now adopt, and which unfortunately they haven't as yet, because, as I said, a lot of things which the Prophet had been asked because of his specific mission, they have been wrongly, pulled into our own dealing with non-Muslims, not realizing the fact that for Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, it was something of a prerogative that he had to punish non-Muslims because they had intentionally denied themselves, and it was not out of any confusion or any misunderstanding, but deliberate denial. So the Quran talks about the Jews and Christians, or all the harsh verses of the Quran, in other words, and Hadith, of course, I can include, that wherever you'll find harshness regarding non-Muslims, it'll be because of the fact that they are the ones who are addressed as the Jews and Christians of the era of the Prophet Muhammad, and they are the ones who were convinced. And the Quran says, hasadam min indi anfusihim, because of their own vested interest or their jealousy or other reasons, they denied them in spite of being convinced in their hearts that they are facing a true prophet. So this is something which is specifically for the era of Prophet Muhammad. And when you understand that these harsh verses have a background, then you'll clearly understand that today the biggest challenge that you have, and the biggest opportunity you have at the same time, is to come closer. All the Abrahamic faiths, the three Abrahamic faiths, if they can come closer and they can understand these issues and sort them out, I think that they can really make a huge difference. And then, for example, the other half of the world, which is the Chinese and the Buddhists and the Hindus, which may be the other part, they can be, I mean, a good communication line can be established with them, because after all, they are not from the Abrahamic tradition. But again, they have a very vast presence on the planet Earth. So if these Abrahamic religions are able to come together and sort out these differences, understand how they actually complement and supplement each other, so this could be a way out to even reach out to Buddhists and Hindus and the Chinese, which of course are exponents of Buddhism or Shintoism or Confucianism.
We actually have quite a few Buddhists who frequent this channel and comment, and they might even be watching this video right now. As well as over the last couple months, I've been talking to a certain amount of Jews, and I find that there is a lot of overlap, and we do have a lot more in common. And coming from a Christian background and dealing in my dealings with Jews, it makes me wonder about the verse where it said that in our love and affection, Muslims are closer towards Christians than we are towards Jews. I wonder, is that more so dealing with that specific time, or is that for all time?
Yeah, that is for that specific time, because you see, if you read the Quran, you'll find that the Quran is very, very, it actually praises the Christians a lot. And if you study Surah Hadith, it says that the followers of Jesus, exact words are, وَجَعَلْنَا فِي قُلُوبِ الَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُ رَأْفَةً وَرَحْمَةً. So we have created a lot of mercy and affection in the hearts of the followers of Jesus. So they have a certain amount of, I mean, the missionaries, the Christian missionaries are the best reflection, the way they are selfless, the way they live for others. We find a very particular liking of the Quran regarding these Christians, that they are the ones, because of the fact that the Prophet Jesus himself had a very specific and a very towering personality. He was an icon of mercy and forgiveness and humility, that the Quran says that this was transferred to his followers. So I think that you'll find that Christians, and this is a point I'm making regarding the Christians of all times, that they have this aura of affection and mercy and humility in them. But as far as the verse that you have cited, which says that you'll find Christians to be closer to your own tradition than the Jews, that has a specific background, and that is the one in which actually you can see that the real book before the Quran was actually the Torah. And Jesus, as he has said a number of places, specifically the one in which he has said that I have not come to abrogate the Torah, I've just come to complete it. So the actual book which was before the Quran is in fact the Torah. So Injil is just a supplement to the Torah. So that is why basically the followers of Moses, of course, are the ones who are addressed here. And they are told that they have, because of the fact that they see now that the prophet or the last prophet is now coming from another generation, or from their cousin progeny, that they have this jealousy that why didn't he come from their own lineage? And that has made them very harsh and very, very averse to Muslims. So that particular verse has that background. So if you relate it to that in this way.
Thank you. That was a wonderful explanation. And just my last question, I'm not going to hold you up for too much longer. I know you're a busy man. Sectarianism, how can we move past that? You know, I know every sect, they have their own hadiths that they work with, and they also have a counter narrative of history, or a certain narrative of history that they work with. How can we move past that?
I think we just discussed that, the issue of intellectual liberty. If we allow the scholars of every sect to, I mean, not only allow, but in fact encourage them that they should follow the voice of their intellect and conscience instead of following the voice of their imam, especially when they think in their own hearts that the view of another imam is more convincing, but they have shut their eyes off to it simply because they are not his followers. So I think the biggest thing is that taqleed, especially when it comes within scholars, and a scholar who is born within the Hanafite tradition is bound to die as a Hanafite scholar. That is where the problem is. So sectarianism can be overcome easily, I think, if all scholars are regarded to be our heritage, a collective heritage, and we don't distinguish between them. We study all of them, and we form an opinion regarding the data that we have and whatever convinces us. And that is precisely what will make us come out of this stronghold or this fortress in which all of us are somehow involved in, or we have put ourselves into, and we are not willing to come out. So because of the fact that we have made we have made a group of scholars, a few group of scholars, to be the only ones which are actually our ancestors or the ones that we would study from. If we change this, and for us, every scholar becomes a reputed personality. He is respectful for us, and we'll study all of them, but we will follow what we think. And when I say we, I refer specifically to the scholars, because, of course, for the common man or the ordinary person, he might not be very well equipped for that. But this taqleed thing really gets to its ultimate. I mean, the saddest part is when the scholars themselves are bound by this taqleed. No, they should be given this freedom of choice to form an opinion, and they should be made to study every scholar. Instead of a fact that we have a Hanafi madrasa or a Shafi madrasa, no, we should have a Muslim madrasa or Islamic madrasa in which all scholars, even if they are Shia scholars or Sunni scholars, all divides, whatever they may be, they must be studied equally. And that is the only way I find. And I also think that this might be at this moment more of wishful thinking, but I think that this is the only way out.
I totally agree with you. And I find that after having had a broader outlook in studying the Muslim intellectual tradition, even talking to non-Muslims when they bring certain contentions, knowing that, okay, this opinion exists elsewhere, I might not agree with it, but telling the non-Muslim, like, hey, well, Muslims do hold this position. It just shows that we're not monolithic, and we have a diverse, a wide variety of opinions and scholarship out there, and we're not just so monolithic.
Right.
So yes, thank you. Those were wise words. I do have one question for you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this interview dropped on me so randomly. I was in the process of interviewing. I was getting into the process of interviewing more scholars that I've been following just to get better insight on certain topics. Some people from your institute had reached out to someone I know and had contacted me, seeing if I wanted to do an interview with you. I was wondering why was I picked for this? I felt a little ill-equipped, but you know, it worked out. I guess. Yeah. Why was I picked for this?
I
If
have
you don't
no
mind me
idea.
asking. Okay. All right.
I don't know.
Okay. I
But I
guess it'll
think you.
forever be a mystery. Oh, sorry. Were you gonna say something?
So I said this is news to me as well. So I think my first introduction to you was the message that you sent to me via WhatsApp and told me that you would like to interview me. And I think one of our representatives in the Canada office, if I'm not mistaken, he told me that he had met someone, or someone had connected with him, and he had asked him to do an interview or something like that. To be honest, I didn't even reflect much on what went on or what transpired, and all the thing that I had was, or the choice that I was given was, you just pick up the date and the time,
Okay.
and I have no other choice.
That was the only choice I was given as well, Dr. Saleem. Just the pick a date and day, or pick a date and time, and we'll make it happen. But I totally feel privileged having done this. Again, as I mentioned to you, I was watching you on Mufti Abu Layth. That was the first time I became aware of you almost a year ago. And to have you right here with me for this interview on my YouTube channel, has truly been a blessing. Thank you, and I greatly appreciate it. And feel free, if more interviews can transpire, I just would like to become more familiar with your work. Over the last 2 weeks, I did as much reading as I could. I watched as many as your lectures as I could, and it was the lecture on intellectual liberty that really stuck with me. I tried my best to construct this interview around that premise.
Mm-hmm.
And after hearing you talk, and you came up with so many, you said so many things that sparked so many ideas in my mind, I kind of abandoned my notes just a little bit. But you know, hopefully we can have another engagement,
Right.
because a lot of what you mentioned in this interview, a lot of what Al-Mawrid Institute is about, is the same thing that this channel is about. And I'm starting to find more Muslims are coming to the same conclusions, that we need to forego just pigeonholing ourselves in one particular sect and start taking this tradition and religion as a whole.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. And if you would like to close with any words, Doctor, we'll end it right here.
Well, just one thing maybe, and that is that I would say that the procedure or the methodology of religion is no different from the methodology of science. Science bases itself on evidence and facts, and things which are based on evidence and facts, they always form a theory and a well-constructed theory until the time some other theory displaces it. I think it's very similar with religion. So just as the universe is the work of God, and scientists interpret the working of this universe, and each time they come up with a new theory which is better than the previous one. So very similarly, the word of God is also something which needs to be interpreted, and human minds keep on interpreting it. And again, the methodology is the same. So in the science, you interpret the work of God, and in the case of religion, you interpret the word of God. And in both cases, it is the reasoning and the ability of that reason to stand to the test of time that counts. And this is something which I think we all need to perhaps discuss more, because this will pave the way in bringing people from all walks of life very close to each other.
Thank you for that. And I hope to look more into Al-Mawrid Institute, and I will be plugging a link in the description along to your YouTube videos and anywhere else people can find your work.
Okay.
Thank you again, Dr. Saleem.
Thank you. You're most welcome, and it was very nice talking to you.
It was very nice talking to you as well. God bless.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.